The rain in Seattle doesn't pour. It seeps into your bones. I stood by my husband's fresh grave, after 5 years of nursing him through his illness. I was clutching his final letter when my son, pushed by his wife, told me I was making a scene. He told me I should leave. He actually pushed me away from my own husband's funeral. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am 62 years old. I stood by the rectangle of freshly dug earth that waited for my husband, David. The canopy above us did nothing to stop the mist, that classic Pacific Northwest rain that isn't really rain at all, but a cold, airborne dampness that finds its way past wool coats and into your very marrow. I had been cold for 5 years, ever since David's diagnosis. But this was different. This was the cold of the end. I could feel my son, Arthur, shifting beside me. He was our only child, around 35 now, though today he looked like a lost teenager. His wife, Sabrina, was attached to his ear, her perfectly glossed lips moving in a steady, quiet whisper, even in grief. Sabrina was sickeningly perfect. She was an Instagram health and lifestyle coach, and her morning attire was clearly designer, a stark black sheath that probably cost more than my first car. Her sorrow looked curated, her mascara waterproof and flawless. My own hands were raw, clenched around the single sealed envelope. It was the last thing David had written before his hands lost their final battle with the disease. It was addressed to me. I hadn't opened it. I couldn't. It felt like the last piece of him I had, and to read it would mean admitting he was truly gone. Sabrina detached herself from my son and glided over to me. Her perfume, something musky and expensive, cut through the smell of damp earth and lilies. "Eleanor," she murmured, her voice a performance of sympathetic sugar. "You're making people uncomfortable clutching that." Her eyes flicked to the letter, then to the faces of the colleagues and friends gathered. "You look truly uncontrolled." I tried to ignore her. I tried to focus on the casket, on the memory of David's laugh, on the 50% of my soul that was about to be lowered into the ground. I just wanted one final minute to say goodbye to the man I had spent my life building a world with. Then Arthur was in front of me. His face was a terrible mask of grief, but underneath it, I saw something new, annoyance. He was annoyed at me. "Mom," he said, his voice low and strained. "Sabrina's right. You're drawing attention. Everyone is staring. Please, just give me the letter or step back." The words felt like a slap. The mist, the grief, the exhaustion of the last 5 years, it all coalesced into a sharp, vibrating shock. "Arthur," I whispered, "this is your father's funeral. This is my husband." Sabrina, standing just behind him, gave him a look, a tiny, impatient narrowing of the eyes. It was all the permission he needed. Arthur's hand shot out and clamped down on my elbow. The grip was hard, proprietary. "I think it's best if you leave," he said, his voice void of all warmth. "You're ruining this." He didn't just suggest. He pushed. He physically maneuvered me, his 62-year-old mother, out of the small, roped-off family area. I stumbled back onto the wet grass, bumping into one of David's oldest business partners, who looked away in embarrassment. I stood there, outside the circle of chairs, outside my own family. I watched my son turn his back on me and put a comforting arm around his wife, who leaned into him with a delicate, satisfied sigh. And everyone saw it. Every friend we had, every employee from our company. every person whose respect we had earned over a lifetime. They all saw me, Eleanor Vance, cast out from my own husband's grave. I wasn't born into this world of silent condolences and designer mourning. I come from Portland, from a family where you fixed things because you couldn't afford to replace them. My hands knew the feel of wood glue and grout long before they knew the weight of stock certificates. I put myself through architecture school at the University of Washington, not because I had visions of grand designs, but because I was good with numbers and understood spatial logic. That's where I met David. He was everything I was not. He was the artist, the dreamer, the one who could look at a rotting Victorian facade and see its soul. I was the one who could look at it and tell you exactly how much that soul would cost to save, down to the last penny. We were a perfect, improbable match. We started Vance Restoration with a second mortgage and a rusted-out truck, in a city like Seattle, booming with new glass towers. We went the other way. We saved the old. We took on the impossible projects, the historical buildings everyone else was ready to tear down. David was the heart behind the designs, meticulous, respectful of the original craftsmanship. I was the brain behind the contracts, the payroll, the negotiations. I made sure his art had a budget and a deadline. We became the most respected restoration firm in the Northwest. We weren't just successful, we were essential. Then we had Arthur, our only child. He was wanted, so incredibly wanted. We protected him, perhaps too much. He grew up in the beautiful shell of our life, the stunning home on Lake Washington we'd bought as a wreck and restored ourselves, plank by plank. He never saw the struggle, only the result. He never understood the grit, only the comfort. Our life was built on mutual respect and endless hard work. His was built on the assumption that it would all simply be there. 5 years ago, the foundation of our world cracked. Parkinson's. It's a cruel, slow-motion thief. It takes everything, piece by piece, until the person you love is a prisoner in their own body. Those 5 years were a blur. I would spend 10 hours at the office negotiating a multi-million-dollar civic contract, then come home to change David's linens. I managed spreadsheets and medication schedules. I chaired board meetings, and I spoon-fed my husband. It wasn't a complaint. It was just the reality. It was the closing argument of our marriage vows. I did it because he was David. I ran the company because it was ours. I tried to hold our family together because it was all that mattered. That letter, the one I was clutching at his grave. It wasn't a casual note. It took him a month to write. His coordination was almost gone. I would hear him in his study, the sound of the pen scratching, then a frustrated sigh, then silence. He poured the last of his physical strength into that envelope. He pressed it into my hand 2 days before the end, before the silence truly took him. I hadn't read it. I was too afraid. I knew it was his real goodbye, and as long as it stayed sealed, a part of him was still waiting to speak. The first crack in our foundation appeared 2 years ago, not from within, but from the outside. Arthur met Sabrina at some slick networking event downtown. He brought her home for Sunday dinner, introducing her as a personal brand consultant. I remember asking her what that meant. I help people unlock their potential and monetize their authentic selves, she'd said, her smile never reaching her eyes. I felt an immediate, visceral chill. It was the kind of thing you're supposed to ignore, to write off as generational difference. But I couldn't. Sabrina smiled constantly, a wide, bright, toothy display. But her eyes were always moving. They weren't warm. They were assessing. They swept over our living room, cataloguing the art on the walls, the antique rug, the view of the lake. Her eyes were measuring. Within 6 months, she had completely renovated Arthur, our son, who had always been a little soft, a little aimless, but kind, started changing. His comfortable flannel shirts were replaced by sharp, aggressively modern suits. He started using words I didn't understand. Everything was about synergy and optimizing and my space. He, who had never shown any interest in the company, suddenly had opinions. I tried to talk to him, gently. We were in the kitchen, making coffee. "Arthur," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Sabrina seems very focused on finances." His reaction was immediate and volcanic. "What's that supposed to mean?" He snapped. "You're just jealous because I finally found someone who makes me happy. You've always tried to control me, to keep me under your thumb." I was so stunned I couldn't speak. Control I had paid for his apartment, his car, his entire adult life, waiting for him to find a passion, any passion. Now, this woman had given him a script, and the villain was me. The wedding was a whirlwind. Sabrina planned the entire thing, a lavish, tasteless affair at a 5-star hotel that cost a fortune. Of course, I paid for it. David, already shaky, sat beside me and watched. "We're paying for it to keep the peace." "Elle," he'd whispered, gripping my hand. But there was no peace. We were just buying time. It didn't take long for her to start sniffing around the business. "I was just thinking," she said to me over one of our increasingly tense dinners. "Arthur has such a great mind for strategy. Don't you think he should have an executive role at Vance Restoration? Something that reflects his value?" Arthur, who couldn't read a blueprint and thought joist was a typo, just nodded in agreement. "She's right. Mom, I could bring a lot of fresh energy to the place." I'd looked at David. His illness had stolen his strength, but not his clarity. He was watching Sabrina, his gaze unwavering. Later that night, when I was helping him get ready for bed, he said the words I would never forget. "Be careful, Eleanor," he'd rasped, his voice thin but sharp. "She has empty eyes. There's nothing in there." About a year ago, David's health declined sharply. The Parkinson's, once a tremor, became a prison. He became bedridden, and we set up a hospital bed in our bedroom, the one overlooking the lake. I was exhausted, juggling the company and the round-the-clock realities of care. It was Sabrina who suggested it, her voice dripping with counterfeit concern. "Eleanor, you're a superhero, but you're burning out. Arthur and I should move in. We can manage the nurses, the schedules. We can be here. It's the least we can do." Arthur seized the idea. "It makes sense. Mum, you shouldn't have to do this alone." I was too depleted to fight. A small, foolish part of me was even relieved. So they moved in. And Sabrina didn't come alone. She brought her mother, Brenda, a woman whose primary activity was complaining. Brenda inspected the house and immediately claimed the best guest suite, the one with its own balcony, citing a vague back problem. The invasion was subtle at first. Sabrina called it optimizing. First, she optimized the nursing staff. The private nurse I trusted, who had been with David for 2 years, was suddenly not a good fit. Sabrina hired a new one, someone younger, someone who clearly reported to her. Then, she fired Maria, our housekeeper of over 20 years, the woman who had made Arthur cookies after school. The reason: her energy is too heavy. Eleanor, we need positivity. My home was no longer my own. The scent of my kitchen, usually filled with coffee and old wood, was replaced by the acrid smell of sage smudge sticks Sabrina was constantly burning. The worst part was the isolation. She began to gatekeep my own husband. I'd come home from a 10-hour day at the office, my shoulders aching, and head straight to our bedroom. Sabrina would physically block the door, a serene smile on her face. "He's just fallen asleep. Eleanor," she'd whisper, "you're bringing such a frantic energy from the office. It's not good for him." "Sabrina, he's my husband. Let me pass. I'm just trying to protect his peace," she'd say, her voice hardening just enough. "Arthur and I have been handling it all day. We have it under control." I looked to Arthur, expecting him to defy her. But my son, my kind boy, just nodded. "She's right, Mum. He needs calm. She just wants what's best for Dad. You're always so stressed." My time with David became rationed. I was a visitor in my own marriage. Sabrina started screening calls, telling our oldest friends that David was not up for visitors. I would sit in the living room, listening to the muffled sounds from my own bedroom, feeling like a ghost in the house I had built. The red flag that finally cut through my exhaustion came 3 months ago. I was online, paying bills, reviewing the financials. I checked the joint bank account, the main one David and I had shared for 40 years. There was a pending authorization request, a request to add Sabrina's name as a signatory. My blood ran cold. I found her in the kitchen, blending a kale smoothie. I kept my voice low. "Sabrina, why did you try to add your name to my bank account?" The performance was immediate. Her eyes welled up. Her lip trembled. "Oh, Eleanor," she gasped, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I was just trying to help the medical supply bills. They're so confusing. And Arthur is so worried about money. I just thought I could help pay them, to take one thing off your plate. I didn't want to bother you." Arthur walked in, as if on cue. He saw his wife in tears and me, standing stiffly with my laptop. "Mom." "What now?" he demanded. "What did you say to her?" "She tried to get access to our money." "Arthur." "She was trying to help," he shouted, his face purple. "My God. You are so paranoid, you just can't trust anyone. Can you? After everything she's doing for us. For Dad. This is how you treat her." I didn't answer. I just looked at Sabrina, who was sobbing into Arthur's chest, her eyes closed in a mask of perfect victimhood. I had my answer. That night, I went to my study. I ordered 3 small security cameras, the kind marketed for medical monitoring. I told the nurse Sabrina hired that I was worried about David falling and wanted to be able to check on him from my office. I installed one facing the bed, one on the door, and one aimed at the desk where his medication was kept. I was no longer a wife. I was a watchdog. I was in my study, trying to reconcile the quarterly reports for the firm. The audio monitor from David's room was always on, a quiet static of shifting sheets and the low hum of the oxygen machine. It was the soundtrack to my life for the past year, most of the time. I tuned it out. It was just noise. Then, I heard it. "Eleanor." It wasn't a moan. It wasn't the mumble of sleep. It was my name. It was thin, dry, and cracked. But it was his voice. The voice I hadn't truly heard in months. I dropped my pen. My chair shot back. hitting the wall. I didn't bother to close the laptop or turn off the light. I ran. My feet barely touched the hallway runner. I reached our bedroom, my heart pounding with a desperate, terrifying hope. She was there. Sabrina was standing in the doorway, as if she were a bouncer at a club. She held a glass of green juice. "He's finally resting," she whispered, holding up a hand to stop me. "I heard him," I said, trying to catch my breath, trying to see around her into the dim room. "He called me. David. Let me in." Sabrina's smile was tight, a mask of pity. "Eleanor, you must be exhausted. You're hearing things. The nurse just gave him his medication. He is settled. The last thing he needs is to be disturbed." "I am not disturbing him," I insisted, my voice rising. I stepped forward. He called my name. "Let me see my husband." I tried to push past her, to get to the man I had loved for 40 years. Sabrina didn't move. She put her hand flat on my chest, physically blocking me. "You are being selfish," she hissed, the sweetness evaporating instantly, her voice now a cold sliver of steel. "You only ever think about yourself. You and your stress. You're upsetting his energy. You are not going in." Before I could answer, she slammed the heavy oak door in my face. The click of the latch echoed in the silent hallway. I stood there, stunned. My hand was still raised, my fingers inches from the wood I had stripped and refinished myself. I pounded once. "David." From the other side of the door, I heard it one more time, muffled and desperate. "Eleanor." It was a question. He was wondering where I was. Then I heard Sabrina's voice, loud and artificially bright. "It's okay. David, shh, just rest. Everything is fine." The silence that followed was absolute. I heard his call, and then I heard her smother it. I didn't pound again. I just stood there, my forehead resting against the cool wood, my body rigid. I was a prisoner, locked out of my own marriage. I was standing in the hallway of the house I built, while a stranger stood guard over my husband's final moments. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, my arms wrapped around my knees. I don't know how long I stayed there. Hours, maybe. I just stared at the doorknob, waiting. He lapsed into a coma that night. He never spoke again. David died 2 days later, with me sitting in a chair in the hallway, listening to the silence. After the coroner left, after Arthur had performed his loud, sobbing grief and been led away by his dutiful wife, I finally went into the room. It was cold, sterile. The nurse Sabrina had hired was efficiently stripping the bed. "I'll do that," I said. My voice sounded rusty. She looked at me, shrugged, and left the linens in a pile. I was alone with him, with the shell of him, and the room that no longer felt like ours. I pulled the fitted sheet from the mattress, the scent of antiseptic filling the air. As I lifted the pillow, the one his head had rested on, my fingers brushed against something stiff. It was the envelope. He had hidden it, tucked between the pillow and the pillowcase, where no nurse would find it, where only I would. He knew. He knew they were keeping me from him. I sank onto the bare mattress, the sealed letter clutched in my hand. It was the only thing I had left. The last words. The goodbye that had been stolen from me. It was 2 days before the funeral. The world was a fog of sympathetic phone calls and casserole dishes I would never eat. I was on autopilot, which is how I found myself in the glass-walled conference room of our longtime attorney. Harrison. He and I were supposed to be finalizing the paperwork for the estate. A simple review of David's will, which I already knew by heart. I just need to grab the revised trust schedule from my office. Eleanor, Harrison said, his face a mask of professional sorrow. I'll be right back. I nodded, staring at the Seattle skyline. The room was too warm. I felt numb, disassociated. I was just a body in a chair, going through the motions. The conference room door was thick, but it hadn't clicked fully shut. From the waiting area outside, I heard voices, low and conspiratorial. One was lazy and whining. I recognized it as Brenda, Sabrina's mother. "Are you sure you've got this handled?" Brenda was saying. "What did the old man actually leave?" And then I heard a sound I had never heard before. Sabrina laughed. It wasn't her bright, tinkling social laugh. This was a low, throaty, dismissive sound. It was the laugh of a predator that had just cornered its meal. "Oh, please. Mum, Arthur is a complete wreck," Sabrina said, her voice dripping with contempt. "He's so busy being in mourning, he can't even think straight. I had him sign a temporary power of attorney. To handle the immediate press and financial details," I told him. He signed it without even reading it. "And the old woman?" Brenda asked. "Eleanor. She can have the house. Who cares?" Sabrina's voice was bored. "It's a teardown. Anyway, the real prize is the company. David's will leaves his 50% of Vance Restoration stock to Arthur. And Arthur is mine. We'll have the whole company liquidated inside of 6 months. We're cashing out." I sat perfectly still. My blood, which had felt thick and cold for days, suddenly felt like ice water. I wasn't grieving anymore. I was listening. Then came the final, unexpected twist. "The very first thing I'm doing," Sabrina continued, and I could hear the smile in her voice, "is dissolving that stupid cancer charity David set up. All that seed money just sitting there. It's time to reinvest it. In us." That was it. That was the moment. It wasn't just greed. David had started that fund after his own sister died of leukemia 10 years ago. It had been his passion project, his way of leaving something good behind. And this creature was going to gut it for a quick payout. Sabrina wasn't just a parasite. She was a ghoul, dancing on his grave before the dirt was even on the coffin. The numbness in my veins didn't turn to fire. It turned to steel. My grief coalesced into a single, cold, hard point of clarity. I finally understood everything. The fake tears, the blocked doorway, the stolen goodbye. It was all a hostile takeover. The door to the conference room opened, and Harrison returned, holding a sheaf of papers. "All right, Eleanor, I'm sorry about that. Now, as we discussed, the official reading of the will is scheduled for next week." I held up my hand, stopping him. He looked at me, confused by the sudden change in my demeanor. The weeping, broken widow was gone. The woman who ran a multi-million-dollar company was back. "Harrison," I said, my voice perfectly level. "We need to change the plan for the will reading." "Of course," he said, pulling out his pen. "We can postpone it, if it's too much." "No," I said. "We're not postponing. We're moving it up. It's going to happen immediately after the eulogies. At the funeral." I walked out of Harrison's office and back into my own home, a place that had become enemy territory. The mask of the grieving widow slipped back into place as easily as breathing. I was hollowed out, but not by grief, by purpose. Arthur was on the sofa, his head in Sabrina's lap, while she stroked his hair and looked at her phone. They barely glanced up when I entered. To them, I was a ghost, a relic of a life that was already over. They were the future. That was their first mistake. I went into my study, the one I had shared with David for 40 years, and closed the door. I sat at my desk and picked up the phone. I did not make a list. I knew exactly who to call. My first call was to Marcus Thorne. I knew him by reputation only. He was a Pulitzer-nominated investigative reporter for the Seattle Times, a man who had brought down 2 city council members and a fraudulent green energy conglomerate. He specialized in financial crimes and charity fraud. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "My name is Eleanor Vance. You don't know me, but you knew of my husband, David. His funeral is in 2 days. He was a great admirer of your work. It would mean a great deal if you would attend as a friend of the family." There was a pause. Reporters are, by nature, suspicious. "A friend of the family, Mrs. Vance." "Yes," I said. "I believe you will find the proceedings noteworthy, especially regarding David's philanthropic legacy." I heard the click of his keyboard. He knew exactly what David's legacy was. "I'll be there," he said. My second call was to every member of the board of directors for Vance Restoration. These were men and women I had known for decades. "Walter," I said to our COO, "I am calling to inform you that attendance at David's funeral is mandatory for the entire board. Not as friends, but in your official capacity. There will be an emergency shareholder announcement immediately following the service." He was flustered. "Eleanor, is this appropriate?" "Can't it wait?" "It cannot," I said, and hung up. My third call was to the 3 directors of the David Vance Cancer Fund. "Mary," I said, "I trust you and the other board members will be at the funeral. I will be making a formal announcement regarding the fund's future endowment. You will want to be present." I finished the calls in under 15 minutes. Sabrina and Arthur were still in the living room, whispering about catering for the reception. They were busy planning a party, oblivious to the fact that I was planning a public execution. I opened my safe. I took out 2 items. The first was David's letter, still sealed. My hand trembled, but I didn't open it. I wouldn't. Not yet. The second was a thick document portfolio, freshly drawn up by Harrison and stamped by a notary. It felt heavy in my hands. I placed both in the inner pocket of the handbag I would carry to the funeral. I walked past the living room on my way to my bedroom. I stopped for a moment, watching my son. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and empty. He was my child, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, the boy whose fevers I had soothed. And I knew, with the certainty of an avalanche, that after tomorrow, he would be gone from my life forever. I was about to save my husband's legacy, but in doing so, I had to finally accept that I had lost my son. The sadness of it was a physical weight, but it did not change my resolve. The night before the funeral, Sabrina came into my bedroom. I was looking at the black suit I planned to wear. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, her voice full of that false, sugary sympathy. She held up a simple, high-necked black dress from my closet. "You should wear this." I looked at the dress. It was plain, modest, forgettable. "Today is about David," she continued, "and his legacy. Her eyes were bright. You shouldn't wear anything that draws too much attention to you. It's better to just be simple, in the background. She was telling me to be invisible. She was so sure of her victory that she was dressing me for my own surrender. I took the dress from her hand and forced a small, tired smile. "Thank you, Sabrina," I said, my voice a perfect imitation of a broken woman. "You are so very thoughtful." And so, I stood by the grave, wearing the simple, forgettable dress Sabrina had chosen for me. The cold mist hadn't let up. It clung to my hair and my coat. I clutched the handbag containing the documents, and in my hand, I held David's sealed letter. The crowd was a sea of black umbrellas. The entire Seattle business community was there. I saw the board of Vance Restoration, looking uncomfortable and confused about my summons. I saw the directors of the Cancer Fund, huddled together, and, standing near the back under a large oak, I saw Marcus Thorne, his notebook already out, his eyes missing nothing. He wasn't just observing, he was scanning. He knew something was wrong. I focused on the casket. This part was real. The pain was an ocean, and I was letting myself feel it one last time. This was my final goodbye to David, my partner, the man I had loved, the business, the betrayal that came second. Sabrina, sensing my genuine grief, saw it as weakness. She saw it as a problem to be managed. She leaned into Arthur's ear, her face a perfect portrait of concerned delicacy. But I knew what she was saying. Her whisper was a snake in the garden. "Get her to back off," she was hissing, just loud enough for me to hear over the minister's platitudes. "She looks insane, just clutching that letter. It's making our brand look unstable. This is affecting our image." Arthur, his face puffy and pale, looked at me. His gaze was full of pain. Yes, but also that same terrible annoyance. I was a problem for him. His wife, the woman who had isolated him from his family, had told him I was a problem. He moved toward me. "Mom," he said, his voice a low command. "Please, don't make a scene. Just step back. I'm saying goodbye." "Arthur," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I couldn't look at him. "You're drawing attention." He snapped. He was parroting her. He didn't even have his own words. "This is my husband." The words were torn out of me, louder than I intended. The minister paused. Everyone looked. This was the opening Sabrina wanted. She surged forward, her hand, covered in a delicate black leather glove, reaching for the letter in my hand. "Eleanor, stop it," she cried, playing the part of the stabilizing daughter-in-law. "It's just paper. He's dead. Let it go." She tried to snatch it. I pulled my hand back, and in that moment, seeing her hand try to take the last thing David had given me, my grief solidified into something unbreakable. Arthur saw only his wife, seemingly being rebuffed by his hysterical mother. "Mum, just go," he shouted. His hands landed on my shoulders. "Go now, you're ruining this." And he pushed me. He shoved his 62-year-old mother, his father's wife of 40 years, backward, away from the casket. I stumbled on the wet grass, catching my balance just before I fell. The crowd gasped. I saw Walter, my COO, take a step forward, then stop, unsure. Sabrina rushed to Arthur's side, grabbing his arm, nuzzling his shoulder. "It's okay, darling. It's okay," she cooed, and as she turned her head, burying her face in his coat, I saw it. A tiny flicker of a smile at the corner of her mouth. a smile of absolute, unadulterated victory. She had done it. She had physically and socially replaced me. She had won. I straightened my simple black dress. I looked at my son, who refused to meet my eyes. I looked at the coffin. Then I turned. I did not walk toward the line of limousines. I did not flee in tears. I walked slowly, deliberately, to the edge of the gathered crowd, my head held high. I stopped directly beside Marcus Thorne. He looked at me, his eyes sharp with a dawning understanding. He had just witnessed the lead-in to his story. I stared straight ahead at the minister, who was now nervously resuming his speech. I waited. The trap was set. Now. It was time for the eulogies. The minister, flustered by my public expulsion, quickly wrapped up his prayer. He invited my son, Arthur, to the podium to deliver the eulogy. Arthur walked up, his shoulders slumped. He pulled a piece of paper from his designer suit jacket. He began to read in a monotone voice, his eyes glued to the page. My father, David Vance, was a man of vision. The words were hollow. They were corporate speak, laced with meaningless platitudes about legacy and passing the torch. They were not Arthur's words. They were Sabrina's. She had written my son's eulogy for my husband. I watched him drone on about the next generation and honoring his vision, and I felt nothing but a cold, final pity. He finished and stepped down, looking relieved. But before the minister could speak again, Sabrina herself stepped forward and touched the microphone. She hadn't been on the program. "If I could just say a few words," she said, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. The crowd, sensing a touching, spontaneous moment, leaned in. As Arthur's new wife, and as a daughter-in-law David, truly cherished, she paused, dabbing a perfectly dry eye. David's legacy is so important. It's more than just buildings. It's a future. And to continue that legacy, Arthur and I have decided we will be stepping up to take a new leadership role at Vance Restoration. It's what he would have wanted. I saw the board members exchange sharp, confused glances. Arthur just stared at the ground. "Of course," Sabrina continued, her voice gaining strength. "This new responsibility means we must streamline. Therefore, we will be announcing a temporary pause on all philanthropic activities of the David Vance Cancer Fund, effective immediately, pending a full, structural review." That was it. That was the signal. She had just publicly announced her intention to defraud a charity. Before she could say another word, a strong, clear voice cut through the damp air. "Excuse me. That is quite enough." It was Harrison, our attorney. He was walking directly to the podium. Sabrina looked at him, utterly bewildered. "Excuse me," she said, her voice losing its sweetness. I said, "That is enough. Miss," Harrison said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He was no longer a gentle family lawyer. He was an officer of the court. He stood beside her at the microphone. "You are providing false and misleading information at a funeral service." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Sabrina's face went from confused to pale. "How dare you?" she began. "I dare," Harrison said, "because I am the executor of David Vance's estate, and more importantly, I am the legal counsel for the actual owner of Vance Restoration." He turned to the crowd, his voice projecting clearly. "And now, the founder, majority shareholder, and true owner of Vance Restoration, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, would like to say a few words. Every head in the crowd swiveled, first to Harrison, then to the back, where I stood. I saw Marcus Thorne flip his notebook to a fresh page and click his pen. I could see the small red light on his digital recorder. I began to walk. I moved from the wet grass of the periphery onto the AstroTurf carpet laid for the family. I walked past the row of shocked board members. I walked past my son, whose mouth was hanging open. I walked past Sabrina, who looked as if she'd been struck by lightning. I stepped up to the podium. In my simple, forgettable black dress, I was no longer shaking. The cold mist felt good on my skin. I looked out at the crowd, at the friends, the partners, the colleagues. I let the silence hang for a beat. Then, I leaned into the microphone, my voice perfectly clear. Carrying over the entire cemetery, I looked directly at Arthur. "I was just kicked out of my husband's funeral," I said, "by my own son." Sabrina's face, a moment ago so perfectly composed in its victory, contorted into a mask of pure rage. "She's lying!" she shrieked, her voice cracking, losing all its polished sweetness. "She's in shock. She's hysterical. Someone get her away from the microphone, Arthur. Do something." Arthur looked at her, then at me, his mind clearly unable to process what was happening. He looked like a child watching his parents fight, paralyzed and useless. I didn't look at Sabrina. I held up the thick document portfolio I had taken from my handbag. I held it for the board, for Harrison, and for Marcus Thorne to see. "This," I said, my voice cutting through her, screeching, "is not my husband's will. This is my will, and this is my company." A new, deeper silence fell over the crowd. Vance Restoration was founded by me, Eleanor Vance, as a sole proprietorship before I married David. He was my brilliant partner, my love, and a capital contributor. But he was never the majority owner. His will, which my son and his wife were so eager to execute, leaves Arthur 50% of David's capital stake. That stake amounts to exactly 10% of the total value of the company, not 50%, not controlling interest. 10%. Sabrina stopped screaming. She was frozen. She understood numbers. She was doing the math, and her face went a shade of white I had never seen on a living person. Arthur just looked lost. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "I am talking about the truth." "Arthur," I said, my voice softening for just a moment with the last echo of my love for him. "A truth you never bothered to learn." I hardened my gaze and looked past him to the board members. "And since my son, the inheritor of that 10% stake, has demonstrated such catastrophic weakness of judgment and has aligned himself with a woman who just publicly announced her intent to defraud a charity, I, as the 90% majority shareholder and chairwoman of the board, am calling an emergency vote. Right here. Right now. I vote to dissolve Vance Restoration. All assets will be liquidated. All contracts will be terminated." The shock was electric. This wasn't a family squabble. This was the public dismantling of a Seattle institution. Arthur wasn't inheriting a legacy. He was inheriting a small check after taxes and liquidation fees. I turned my gaze to Sabrina. She was trembling, her mask of perfection shattered. "As for the David Vance Cancer Fund," I said, "you were right, Sabrina. It will be restructured." I then held up the other item from my bag. David's sealed letter. "I lied," I said, my voice quiet, directed at the coffin. This isn't a love letter. I was never so arrogant as to assume. I haven't read it. I couldn't. I gave it, sealed, to Mr. Harrison this morning, in the presence of a witness. Harrison stepped forward. Mrs. Vance is correct. The letter was opened. It is a sworn affidavit, witnessed by his night nurse, written 3 weeks before he died. I looked back at Arthur and Sabrina. It details, in David's own shaky hand, his wife's attempts to gain access to his bank accounts. It details his fear of her vicious greed. It details his horror at how she was isolating him from me. And it details a moment I was not aware of when she tried to have him sign a new will, one that disinherited me and Arthur both, leaving everything to her. Marcus Thorne was no longer writing. He was taking photographs, the flash of his camera popping, capturing the ruin of Sabrina's face. This affidavit, I announced, will be the centerpiece of a petition I am filing tomorrow morning, a petition to enact the final clause of my husband's actual will, a clause that states if his primary heir, Arthur, is found to be under duress or undue influence, his inheritance is forfeit, and all of David's assets, his 10%, his personal accounts, and this house, our beautiful home on the lake, are to be transferred, not to me, not to Arthur, but entirely and irrevocably to the David Vance Cancer Fund, to be managed by an independent board, starting with the directors standing right here. Arthur finally understood. He crumpled, his legs giving out, sinking to his knees on the wet grass, staring at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. She didn't look at him. She just stared at me, her empty eyes finally full of pure, unadulterated hate. I looked at them both, the son I had lost and the woman who had taken him. I leaned into the microphone one last time. "Sabrina," I said, "you were right. It's just paper." "Arthur," I said, "you were right. I should leave." I stepped down from the podium. "From now on, you are both on your own." I didn't look back. I walked off the platform, down the aisle, and straight through the stunned crowd. I walked past Marcus Thorne, who nodded at me with a look of profound respect. I left the grave, the casket, the sun, and the entire life I had known. I left them all behind in the wreckage and kept walking. Thank you all so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's connect and share our thoughts. And if you enjoyed this, please subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary. Give this video a like and show your support by hitting that hype button so more people can hear this story.